Oh, hello, it's Miles here at Fabricana. Today we've got a great video. It's going to be making this lovely kimono style top. It's not an authentic Japanese kimono, but it is inspired by it. I love the collar detail. I love all the clean finishing that we have on the inside, the nice deep sleeves. So I really feel that there was a need for a video like this. It's really great that you don't have to have a pattern. I'm going to give you all of the directions for calculating the size of the pieces. Everything starts with a rectangle, so we don't have to do any curves or angles. So I hope you enjoy this video. Continue to follow along. There is a companion video we also made in a coordinating fabric, this beautiful woven belt. So we're going to include a link, or you can find that on our YouTube channel as well, the method of doing the fabric woven belt. So without further ado, we're going to get started. Before we do, I just want to remind you to follow us on Instagram, on Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're enjoying this content, turn your notifications on so you don't miss any of this fun content. So before we begin cutting, let's take a look at all of the materials that we're using for this tutorial. The first thing that I'm very excited about is this beautiful, it's a 5-ounce denim, so it's fairly lightweight. I'm calling this video kind of beginner plus. So there's a lot of pattern making, a little bit more, advanced sewing, but intended for beginners. So let's stick to kind of a stable woven fabric, not too light, not too slippery. So this denim is the perfect quality. I'm going to need just a piece of paper to make a pattern for a mitered corner later. We're going to use a plate. I'm going to let that be a surprise how we're using the plate for a sewing project. I've got the three things here: the self-healing mat, a clear ruler, and a rotary cutter. Those will all work together to help us cut out our pieces. I will still need some regular fabric scissors, some paper scissors. Don't use the same scissors for your fabric and your paper. Then I've got some tailor's chalk to make markings on fabric. I've got a beautiful pink pencil to make some marks on paper, and a measuring tape. So before we get started with the cutting, I just want to say, because I think I missed saying that for the length of top that I'm making, which is going to be about my fingertips length, I've got 2 1/4 yards of 60-inch wide, 150 centimeter fabric. So if you want a longer project, you'll have to adjust the length of the fabric that you need. With that said, I just want to point out we have lots more great content on this YouTube channel, so please subscribe and follow us for all of the updates. We have an online store, so there's lots of new stuff coming through on our Facebook page and our Instagram page as well, so please follow us there. I also want to say, and I didn't mention, of course, we also need, it's a sewing project, we need a sewing machine. Full disclosure, I'm also going to be using my serger I brought in today just to make things go a little bit faster for me. A serger is not necessary, but you will need to finish your seams, maybe just with a zigzag on your sewing machine, or there's lots of other great seam finishing options. I'll be using a serger. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do before we do anything else is we're going to cut a 6-inch strip off of the end of our fabric. I just don't want to forget to do this because it's a really important piece that we want to have the full width of the fabric. So I'm just straightening out my fabric with the selvages lined up. Now, to make life a little bit easier, I'm just going to bring the fold back to the selvages and line that up. So I'm actually going to be cutting through 4 layers of fabric here. Going to use the rotary cutter. If you're not familiar with using your rotary cutter, please watch a video on how to safely use a rotary cutter. It's basically like a razor blade on a wheel, so it is very, very sharp. You want to protect your fingertips at all times. So I've straightened that edge, and now I'm just going to measure 6 inches. So there we have a nice 6-inch strip times the width of the fabric. Width of fabric is a good term to know. It's often abbreviated in patterns as WOF. So if you ever come across that in a pattern, WOF, that means width of fabric. So now that we've cut that off, we're ready to cut the back, the fronts, and the two sleeves. So now that I've cut that strip for the neckband, we're ready to calculate how much we need for the back and the front. So one thing that we're going to do is let's talk about ease. So as everyone knows, for most clothes, they don't fit right to the size of your body. Obviously for swimwear and things like that, they do, but generally, especially for a top like this, we're going to have ease. And the ease is the difference between the size of the garment and the size of the body. So if I measure my chest here at 40 inches, I actually want to add ease for comfort and the way the garment will drape. So I'm actually going to add 20% ease, which means I want to have a 48-inch finished chest measurement. So what that means for the back, which is half of my chest, I want it finished 24 inches. And I'm going to have to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance to either side of my back. So that will bring me to a total width on the back of 25 inches. A little bit of math there, but pretty easy. The next thing we want to look at is the length of our garment. And like I said earlier, I wanted about my fingertips, which is about 34 inches. So that's the finished length. I'm going to add a 3-inch hem as well. So I'll be cutting 37 inches long by 25 inches wide. So we'll maybe just cut there and then I'll show you the cutting. So we've got our fabric laid out. That cut edge, I've got those cut edges lined up. I've got the selvages lined up. Now I need to measure the length. We're going to cut the length across the whole width of the fabric. We won't need the whole width of the fabric, but we will use the extra leftover piece later for the sleeves. So I'm going to measure the length at 37, and I'm going to mark that with chalk. Just a little marking so that I know that everything is square. Then I'm going to use my ruler and my rotary cutter. Again, be very safe with your rotary cutter. I'm going to line up the folded edge of my fabric with a straight line on my mat. I'm going to cut through the 2 layers. My fabric's folded in half. So that's the length, and then we'll move on to cut the width of our back. So now that we have the length of our back cut, we're going to open up our fabric and we can cut down the width that we need. So first of all, I'm going to trim off the selvage. Of course, the selvage is that kind of tightly woven piece on the edge of the fabric when you purchase it. I'm just going to fold my fabric in half, lining up my cut edges at one end, the last 1/2 inch of the edge of my fabric, because we don't want the selvage. It doesn't hang properly. So now I've got a straight edge there. As you recall, we were going to do 25 inches for the width of the back. That's half of our back plus an inch for seam allowances. So the nice thing about this kimono style jacket, it's not a proper traditional kimono, is that everything starts as a rectangle, so we don't need a pattern. So you see it starting to come together. That is the back piece. So we've set aside the extra piece that we had from the width of the back. We're going to save that for the sleeves. So I've put out the rest of the fabric that I had that's still uncut. So we're going to cut out our fronts. Now the calculation for the front is, again, half of our chest, finished chest. Our finished chest is 48, so half of that is 24. Except we want the front to overlap. So we're going to take half of the 24 because we have a left and a right. So we're taking 12, which is half of 24. We're going to add 3 inches for overlap, and then we're going to add 3 inches for the front hem. We're doing a nice, beautiful, wide hem with mitered corners at the hem. So that leaves us, I believe, 12 plus 3 is 15, plus 3 is 18, plus a 1/2 inch for the seam allowance is 18.5 inches wide. And the length is going to be the same as the back, 37. So we're going to cut the length first. So I'm cutting this parallel to these selvages. So that gives us the length that we need. And then I'm going to move on and show you how to cut the widths. So once we've cut our length, we're going to turn our piece the other direction. So I've got my selvages running this way, and just like we did with the back, we're going to remove the selvage before we cut. So I'm just lining those up. It's a really long length, so I'm just going to fold that in half this way. So again, we can just have one quick cut through 4 layers now instead of 2. Line that up on one of the lines of my mat. And that selvage is about a 1/2 inch. So we're just going to remove that 1/2 inch. Okay, so now we can cut the width. And as we recall, let's just do our math again. We're going to put the numbers up on the screen. I know math is never fun. So we have half of the width of the finished garment, which is, the finished is 48. So the cross of the front is 24. We're doing left and right, so we divide that 24 in half again, which gives us 12. We have a 3-inch overlap, so added to the 12 gives us 15. We're adding 3 inches for the hem, so added to 15 gives us 18, plus we're doing a 1/2 inch seam on the side. So now that I've got my nice clean cut edge on the side, this is my lengthwise grain of the fabric going this way. So now we're measuring the width this way. I'm actually just going to use my ruler this time to do that. 18.5 inches. I'll just mark that with chalk. Move the ruler. I'm cutting through 4 layers. That has given us, if I open this up, our 2 front pieces. So now we have the neckband, the back, the 2 fronts. We can move on to cutting the sleeves. So what we're looking at right now is the leftover piece when we cut out our back. This is the extra width that we haven't used yet, and we're going to use this piece for our sleeves. Now the sleeves, rectangles that we need, are going to be 14 inches by 30 inches. You're just going to have to trust me on this one. It's not calculated based on our body measurement or anything, but it's basically a really wide sleeve, and it's going to be about 14 inches long, so it's going to be, I'm guessing, some kind of 3/4 length sleeve. It's a wide sleeve. I don't want it full length because I don't want it going into my coffee and things like that. So we've got the fabric running this way is our grain line. We've got the selvage kind of on the outside edge. So we're going to cut the width first. Again, just to make things simpler, I'm folding the piece in half. I'm going to line up that beautiful cut edge that we had from cutting out the back with my mat, and lining up the fold that I've just created with the mat as well to make sure that everything is square. I'm going to double check my measurements before I cut this. We always say measure twice, cut once. You can't put the fabric back together once it's been cut. So like I said, it's going to be 30 inches wide. So I'm going to cut that. So that gets rid of the other selvage. And then we need 2 pieces that are 14 inches long. So I'm going to turn my fabric. I'm going to fold it in half. Again, the other direction, lining up the cut edges, lining up the nice cut edge on my mat, the new fold, lining up on my mat, and again, double checking my measurements. These are going to be 14 inches each. So if I cut one, just get that nice and straight. Cut one at 14. And if I don't move anything, I can cut the other one on the 28-inch line. So here we have, when we open it out, 2 sleeves. Now we can start actually working on making the pattern take shape. So a brief interruption. As I mentioned before, I am going to be serging the edges. I'm going to go over in just a moment which edges need to be seam finished. If you have a serger, that's awesome. Please use a serger. If you don't, please finish your edges with a zigzag or some your other favorite method. I'll explain in just a moment exactly which edges need to be finished. So I promised that I'd explain exactly which seams needed to be finished. I think I'll do that in order of the way that we cut the pattern pieces. So remember, the first piece we cut was that 6-inch strip. That requires no seam finishing. You're welcome. Then we cut out the back piece, and we had to serge the 2 long lengths and 1 length. And the one if your pattern is directional, ours is not, but if your pattern is directional, that would be the top end of the kimono. The hem does not need to be serged or seam finished. Next, we cut out our fronts, as you recall. Now for the fronts, because we have the nice wide hem across the front, that's going to be doubled. We don't need any seam finishing there, and again, nothing across the bottom, but we do need to finish the shoulder seam and the side seam. Now notice, because we have a left and right, the pieces are seam finished mirror images. So the outside edges and the top, the center is not finished. And finally, we had the 2 sleeves. Our sleeves are identical. Again, we're doing a nice wide hem on the sleeves, so we don't need to do a seam finish on the hem, but we do need to do it on the side seams, and well, which becomes the underarm, and the sleeve head, the top of the sleeve. So just those 3 edges, and that is all the seam finishing we need to do. Now we're ready to move on to construction. I think we'll do the same thing, where we're going to start with the first piece we cut, and we'll prepare that and then move through the rest of the pieces. So here we have our neckband. If you can picture this, of course, like a nice kimono style, this is going to be folded in half and we'll wrap around our neck like so. So the first thing we're going to do, the first thing we have to do, is we're going to press it in half along the length. Now we have a lot more collar than we need, but I'm going to do this to the whole width of the fabric, so we have more than we need. I'd hate to have more than to be short when we're actually applying this to the kimono. So I'm just going to finish pressing this in half, and then I'm going to meet you at the sewing machine for a little tip. So here we have our pressed neckband. We're going to open that up, and the little trick, basically we need to create a perfect little 1/2 inch turn under on one side. So I'm actually going to baste with a 1/2 inch. See where that is on my sewing machine here. There we go. So I've increased my stitch length to 4.0. This basting is actually going to stay in, so make sure you're using a thread that closely matches your fabric, because it's going to be still in there. I'm just going to quickly run off this basting. So once we have that basted, we're actually going to use that seam to use as a fold line. So I'm just going to quickly run over to my iron. I'm going to crease this back, wrong sides together, so you can see the face of the fabric, and then I'll be back to the sewing machine to actually top stitch that in place so it won't move. I'll be right back. So there we go, I promised I'd be right back. We've pressed that seam back along our stitching, so we have a perfect little 1/2 inch tuck under there. Now we want it to stay that way, so we're going to top stitch it in place. So if I use a 3/8 of an inch seam, I've got a 1/2 inch tuck under, so the 3/8 will grab that and hold it in place. I've set my stitch length back to the standard 2.5, and I'm just going to stitch this in place. There we have it. From the back, you can see the stitching is just catching that seam near the edge. This is going to give us a really beautiful tailored look to our finished neckband. Now that we've done that, we're ready to start preparing the back piece of our kimono style top. So whose curiosity was piqued when I said you needed a dinner plate for a sewing project? Well, I'm going to show you why. Here we have our back piece. This is, oh, I've got it upside down. This is the hem. We're going to be working on the shoulder and neck area. As you recall, our piece is 25 inches wide, so we want to find the halfway mark, and which is 12.5, and we're going to mark that on our fabric. Just with our little chalk here, we're going to take our ruler and we're going to mark out our seam allowance, which for this project we're using 1/2-inch seams on everything. And again, I'm using my chalk to just mark our stitching line at 1/2 inch. Then from the center out, we want to mark 3 inches on either side of that for a total of 6. So I've got marking points 3 inches either direction from center. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rest my dinner plate. Let's just tell you how big this plate is so you have an idea. I think it's a pretty standard dinner plate. It's just over 10 inches. But that, when we lay our plate so that the edges of the plate are sitting where our marks meet our seam, we're just going to trace the plate onto the fabric, and that is going to give us a little bit of room for our neck, and then we're going to be able to cut this away. So we finished preparing our back to this point. Now we have our two fronts. I have the top shoulder seam here, that's the side seam, here's the center front. At the hem, we're going to have a beautiful mitered corner. It's going to be a bit of a design detail for our kimono, but we need to create a pattern for this beautiful little miter. So I'm just going to move my fabric out of the way. So this is where the piece of paper comes in handy, and my beautiful pink pencil. So we're doing a 3-inch hem that's doubled. So basically it's 1.5 inches doubled. So I'm going to mark on one long edge 1.5 inches, and then I'm going to mark 3 inches from one edge. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the short edge. This is just a standard piece of paper. We're going to do the same thing, 1.5 inches, and then 3 inches. So the idea is that this is my hem and this is up the center front of the kimono. So if I fold up the hem and I fold up the center front, and then I fold the hem again, and then I fold the center front again. So we look at, that will essentially be the finished hems. So this point right here is where our miter is going to come to. So that point is very important. So I'm going to open out so that we just have 1.5 inches folded on the hem and the center front. And we've got that crossover point. And I'm going to use my ruler and I'm going to draw a 45-degree angle right through that point. I'm going to do that with my pencil. Now that's our stitching line, and then we need to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to cut on the seam allowance with my scissors, my paper scissors, very important. when we open this up, yes, it looks super weird, but basically what we're going to do is we're going to use this as a pattern for the left and right side of our front kimono. And then when we press up the hem, when we press up the center front, that now gives us the perfect little way of sewing the miter. So we'll be bringing the hem to the center front, and then we'll be stitching on that stitching line that we talked about before, and that's going to create the perfect little miter. So we'll see it all in fabric. This is the pattern. I hope everyone's followed along. So I'm going to apply this pattern to the two fronts of the kimono, and then I can show you how to prepare the miter. So here we have one of the sides of our kimono. So we're going to use our piece of paper to line up the hem and the center front. And then using my tailor's chalk, I'm just going to trace out the pattern. I'm going to do this for each of the sides. I think it's easier to do these one at a time because we want it to be really accurate. So using my fabric scissors again, I'm going to trim away the piece we don't need. Like I said, we're going to do that with the other side, and then we can start working on the front hems and the miter. So we've prepared the miters at the front. Now I want to sew the beautiful like double turned 1.5 inch hem down the center front, around the hem to the back, and back up the front. So I actually need to sew a little bit of the side seams. I can't sew the whole side seam because we don't have any sleeves on, but I'm going to be sewing up from the hem, the fronts to the backs. So here's our back piece again. We can recognize that because it has the neck hole cut out of it. I'm going to put our fabrics facing each other, front and back. I'm just going to quickly run to the sewing machine and sew again about a 6-inch hem or seam on the sides starting from the hem, and then I can show you how to do the beautiful doubled hem. All right, so I ran away and sewed that little 6-inch seam from the hem. So it's kind of a bit of an odd garment right now. It looks like some drapes maybe. Anyway, we're ready to start pressing the hem. So I've got the, this is the hem, this is the center front kind of coming up this way. I'm going to fold back 1.5 inches on the bottom. And you can double check that with a seam gauge. I'm just going to quickly double check that with my ruler, make sure I'm being accurate. So I will continue across the hem, but I'm just going to switch now to the center front seam because I really want to show you how to do that miter. So I'm going to fold the center front again, 1.5 inches, getting stitched back, or ironed back. Double check that it's 1.5 inches. Yeah, perfect. So we're going to do this all the way around the bottom hem and the center front hems. And then once we have those corners prepared like this, I'm going to just bring this to the sewing machine and I'll show you how to stitch the beautiful miter. So here we have our little corner prepared. As you recall, this is what it looks like on the back. So the next step that we need to do is we need to bring our hem edge to our center front edge, fold those back together, make them line up really nicely. And then we're going to stitch from the folds there with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We're going to back stitch to start. We're going to continue sewing that 1/2 inch right to that folded edge. We're going to trim off the corner. So if we turn that whole thing inside out, that is how we create our beautiful little miter. So we just need now to do the other corner and press it. So I've pressed my beautiful little miter. It looks even nicer now, nice and tidy. And then I've pressed the rest of the hem all the way around the center front, the bottom, and then up the other center front. Now the thing that I need to do is top stitch this all in place. A lot of it's going to get cut away in the neckline, but that's okay. I'm still going to press it nicely first, stitch it nicely. So I've lined up my needle very close to that folded edge, probably about 1/8 of an inch or so. And I'm just going to try and continue to stitch really nicely close to that creased edge. I'm stitching from the back so that we can actually see what's going on. It would be really hard to stitch from the other side. Just make sure that your bobbin thread is the perfect color to blend in with your fabric. When we get to the corner, we're going to leave our needle in our work, and then we're going to pivot the work 90 degrees. And then we'll continue doing that same beautiful stitch. So here we have our fully hemmed. I know it's weird to do the hem first, but trust me, it's way easier this way. So the next thing that we need to work on is the front neck edge and the shoulder seam. So what we need to do is go back to our the top of our back. So basically the shoulder seam. I'm going to use the ruler to measure the distance from the side seam to the neck edge, where we drew our beautiful little plate, bit of a circle, and that is 9 1/4 inches. So that's basically our shoulder seam. So we need to mark that line on each of our fronts, again measuring from the side seam toward the center front. I'm going to grab some chalk, and remembering that mark was 9 1/4 inches. I'm going to make a mark on the one side. I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side, measuring from the side seam toward the center, 9 1/4 inches. So what this does for us at this point is it marks the shoulder seam on the front. So if I take one of the pieces, so you can kind of see this beautiful front with the beautiful hem. If I find that marked that I did, 9 1/4 inches from the side seam, it might be different from you if you're doing a different size. I'm going to let that kind of fall back and see where I want, basically like doing a jacket lapel, where do I want the neck edge to fall. I kind of want it a little bit lower than the underarm, I think. I think probably about here. So you can mark this, maybe you want something a little bit higher, maybe you want something a little bit lower. So find out what feels good for you and just kind of mark that. Then I'll show you how to cut that neck edge. So I'm taking the front edge that I've marked, and I'm actually going to line that up with the front edge that I haven't marked. I'm going to line up the center fronts and the shoulder seam. So I only have to mark this once. I have the shoulder seam marked, and I have the front neck edge marked. I'm just going to grab my ruler, and I'm going to very carefully line it up with the marks. Find my rotary cutter. I'm going to cut through all the layers. Whew. Bit of a risk there, but successful. So now you can see this is actually the marking for how the kimono neck edge will lay on the body. So now that we have our neck edge prepped, we're going to sew our shoulder seams. So we're going to fold the front over the back. We're going to match up the shoulder seam. We're going to bring that to the sewing machine and stitch it. If you want to put pins in, please do. Again, we're trying to be very beginner friendly here. We're going to do that for both fronts. And then I'll meet you at the sewing machine to sew this seam, and then we can get started on sewing the neckband. So I am very happy. It's starting to look a lot more like the top that we want. I've pressed the shoulder seams open, and I have stay stitched the neck opening right from the center front all the way around. And stay stitching is basically running your fabric through the sewing machine with just a straight stitch through the one layer. It keeps your neck edge from stretching because this is on the bias that could tend to want to grow as we sew. So we put the stay stitching there to keep it from growing. Okay, so we've done our pressing, our stay stitching. Now we are ready to apply. Remember our neck edge we did a while ago? Well, that's ready to get stitched to the garment. So remember, we have one edge that is pressed and stitched, nice and finished. That is actually going to lie on the outside of our garment. So we're actually going to start stitching the band to the inside of the garment. So it's going to be basically right side of the raw edge of the band to the wrong side of the, like left, right, of the right side of our kimono. Now we want to leave a little extra. We should have lots of length for the band. So we're going to leave a little bit of extra hanging, and then we're just going to stitch that band to the inside of the neck edge. Again, leaving a lot of extra hanging off the ends. I'll show you how to finish those ends. But if you want to use pins, if you want to baste it in place first, do what you want. I'll show you the sewing, and then we can get back to figuring out how to finish the neckband. So as I showed you before, we have the raw edge with the right side of the band facing the inside. We're leaving a lot of extra overhang. I'm going to start stitching from the edge of the center front with a 1/2 inch seam. I've stay stitched, so I'm not really worried about the neck edge stretching out. So if you'd like, please put pins in. Otherwise, I'm going to wing it. So as we approach the shoulder seam, we're just going to slow down and just go stitch by stitch. We're going to kind of pivot our work. So the seam allowance now on the back neck edge is still lining up with our neck, with the raw edge of our band. We don't want any puckers. So this could be a little bit trickier because we're sewing a straight line to a curve, but just take your time, stitch by stitch. So here we have the collar stitched on. This was kind of the end of where we stitched. Notice there's still a lot of the collar piece just hanging there. That's fine, we're going to leave that for the time being. What we want to do now is we're going to grade the seam allowance. If you're not familiar with grading, we currently have like 2 or 3 layers in the seam that we just sewed. If we just leave that, it's going to be kind of bulky in the seam, so we want to trim away one of those layers, and the layer we're going to choose is the actual seam allowance from the collar. So I'm just going to quickly trim that. About half of it, it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to trim away a 1/4 inch of that, and I'm going to do that all along the edge of the collar, and then I will meet you back here at the ironing board to show you how to press the collar. So once we've graded the seam allowance along the whole length of the collar, we're ready to press. Now I'm going to be pressing from the face of our top, and we're going to be pressing toward the collar. Make sure that you don't lose that crease that we did originally in our collar. That's a very important crease line. So we just want to press the seam allowances that we've just graded toward the collar. So I've got my iron set at a cotton temperature because I'm using cotton, make sure that your iron is set for the fabric that you're using. You don't want to melt or burn anything. And then just continue to press. Now we're at the back neck part of the collar. And then just continue pressing the rest of the collar, and then I'll show you the next step. So we've got our collar nicely pressed, the seam trimmed. Now we're going to deal with that extra little flap that we have hanging off. So to do that, to work on that, we're going to fold our collar back. We're actually going to pin some of it in place. So remember that nice beautiful folded edge that we have of the one side of the collar? That's going to actually cover the seam that we just sewed to hold the collar onto the jacket. So we're going to just basically pin that in place, that nice folded edge, kind of lining up with our stitching for the collar. So I'm just going to put a few pins in to hold that in place. Once you've got the collar folded in place, you're going to notice the point where the collar joins our little top. There's kind of a little inside corner there. So we're going to use our ruler, and we're going to place our ruler on a 90-degree angle, so 90 degrees parallel to the fold of our collar. We're going to draw a line right to that inside corner. So that line is going to be our stitching line to do the end of the collar. So in order to be able to stitch that, we need a seam allowance. So we're going to draw a second line over from that to give ourselves a seam allowance. I'm going to put another pin in here just to hold everything steady, and then we can cut on this line through all the layers. We're going to repeat this process for the other end of the collar, and then we can go to the sewing machine and I'll show you how to sew this closed. So here we have the end of our collar that we just cut off. We're going to remove a couple of the pins in order to be able to access the seam that we need to sew. So what we're going to do is that beautiful crease line that we created when we created our collar, we're going to actually wrap all the way around so that the collar right sides are facing each other. So we're actually going against this crease. And we are going to line up our two folded edges now. And then we're going to start stitching from the crease line, our halfway point on our collar, to that kind of inside corner. We're using the 1/2-inch seam allowance that we just added to the end of our collar. And we're just stitching right from that creased edge. And then once we've sewn that, we are going to trim our corners fairly close to our stitching without cutting into our fabric, into the corner I should say. We're going to trim the other corner here. Then we're going to grade that seam allowance as well. So just one of the layers of the seam, we're going to trim half of that seam allowance away. And again, this is to reduce bulk. Then we're going to repeat this process for the other end of the collar. So here we have the beautifully stitched end of our collar. So we need to turn that right side out. We're just going to do that easily. We want to roll out that corner so it's a nice sharp point. And then we're going to press that end. Again, just kind of rolling out that seam all the way. So this gives us a much better idea of the finished look of the collar. Once you got that beautiful press in your collar, we want to apply the rest of the pins to the edge that we're going to be stitching, that beautiful folded edge that we have prepared. I'm just going to put pins in. We want that folded edge to cover our line of stitching. We'll be able to see that a little bit more clearly at the sewing machine. which is where I'm going to meet you next, I'm just going to do exactly the same thing, pressing the other end of the collar and putting in the rest of the pins, and then I'll meet you at the sewing machine to do the final top stitch for the collar. So we have our collar pinned in place. We're going to start stitching from this end, so the collar is to the right, the body of our top is to the left. I'm going to remove the first pin. It should kind of stay in place. I've pressed it all nicely anyway. I'm going to line up the folded edge. I have a little red mark on my presser foot that's about 1/8 of an inch from where the needle goes. So that's what I'm going to line up with my folded edge. I'm actually going to start stitching a few stitches away from the fold because it's kind of often hard to start sewing right at an edge. So I'm just going to start with my needle down, and I'm going to do the back stitch. Continue sewing forward. Now I'm holding this nice and taut. We've got the pins in, but we want to make sure that this collar is staying nice and flat as we sew. Making sure that that folded edge is kind of covering our previous stitching underneath. Now this operation that we're doing, if you're a new sewer, this will really come in handy. This is essentially the same process for sewing a collar onto a shirt, for sewing a cuff onto the sleeve. So it's very, even sewing a waistband onto, top stitching a waistband on a pair of pants or a skirt. So if you can master this technique, it can be used in a lot of other projects. I am kind of putting a lot of tension on it as I'm sewing it to keep it flat. It's going to get a little bit trickier as we get to the curve, but just take your time. Make sure that folded edge is always covering that little bit of stitching. Notice I'm just doing a few stitches at a time and then kind of reworking my work. So we're just coming to the end of stitching the collar, removing the last pin. Now when we get back here, we're going to again stitch that folded edge, and then I'm going to back stitch back, and then we can tie off our thread so we don't have any threads hanging off. I'm going to leave myself a nice long thread. So from the back of the stitching, I can pull the needle thread through to the back. So now both threads are on the back. I'm going to tie a knot close to the garment, do a nice double knot. Then I can trim my threads close to the garment so that we have a very nice clean finish on the face of the garment. I'm going to take this to the iron, do a little bit of a touch-up press on the collar, and then we're ready to start sewing the sleeves on. So look at our collar. It is beautiful. So the last thing we need to do, obviously, we're missing some sleeves, so we're ready to put those onto our top. So the sleeve pieces I've got here, as you recall, we finished the short seams. Those are our underarm seams. We finished the top edge where it's going to join the jacket, and we've got the unfinished edge. I'm going to press actually the hem of these just like we did for the hem and the front edge. I'm going to do that. I don't need to show that to you because we've already looked at that. It's basically 1.5 inches pressed up, then another 1.5 inches pressed up, doubled for a total of 3 inches. But once we've done that, we're going to find the halfway point of the top of our sleeve. We're going to fold the sleeve in half. You can use a little bit of marking chalk. I'm going to just put a pin in the halfway point, and then right sides together, I'm going to open up my sleeve, and the right side of the sleeve is going to line up with the shoulder seam on the right side of our top. And I'm going to put a pin lining up that center point with the shoulder seam. I'm going to put a pin in there, and then I'm going to line up those nice beautiful straight edges. I'm going to place more pins, and then I'll meet you at the sewing machine to stitch. So here we have our sleeve stitched to our armhole edge on our top. As you can see, I've pre-pressed the hem on the sleeve. We'll stitch that down later, but it'll be a lot easier to press the sleeve hem while it's open than when it's closed, so please do that. We're gonna just stitch right from our finished edge of our sleeve. Gonna remove that first pin. We're sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We're going to start with a back stitch. Just be careful when you get to the shoulder seam that you keep the seam nice and flat and open. That'll make it much less bulky. We're just getting to the end of the seam. We're going to stitch right to that edge and then do a back stitch. So I'm going to stitch the other sleeve in place. We're going to bring the garment to the iron, and we're going to press the sleeve toward the sleeve, so basically away from the garment, and then I'll show you how to do the underarm seam. So here we have the sleeve stitched on. The seam allowances are pressed towards the sleeves. As you can see, there's a bit of a problem here. We have this big opening on the side, so we need to finish our underarm seam. As you know, the side seam had already been started earlier, but we just want to continue that seam. We're going to do it all in one go, starting from where we left off. So basically, we need to turn our garment inside out. Let's just look at one side first. We need to line up the underarm seams of our sleeve. We're going to match those and place a pin because we want that to match really nicely. Put a few more pins in on the side seam. Finally, the underarm seam of the sleeve, we need to kind of open up the hem so that we can stitch that nice straight seam. But all of that pressing is going to help us to hem it after it's stitched. It's a pretty short sleeve because it's such a drop shoulder that the sleeves are actually fairly short. I'm going to pin the other side. I'll meet with the sewing machine to finish that last seam of the underarm and the side seam. So we're going to start stitching. We're just going to overlap with the stitching that we had done previously. Remember, we're doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to do a back stitch to make sure it's secure. And then I'm going to continue. Now, as we get to that little corner of the underarm, we want to make sure that the sleeves are lined up perfectly, kind of this way. And we want to make sure that we're stitching slightly to the left of the stitching that stitched the sleeve onto the garment, because we don't want to be able to see that join when we turn our garment inside out. So just by the slightest amount, stitch to the left of the previous stitching. Now we're going to stitch a few stitches, maybe 4 or 5 stitches, in from the underarm seam. We're going to leave the needle in our work, and then we're going to pivot 90 degrees so that we're still able to continue a 1/2 inch seam going this direction. You kind of have to eyeball it. It might take a little bit of time to kind of master that visual guide. So I'm going to do the underarm and side seam for the other side. I'll meet you with the ironing board to press this open, and then I'll show you how to do the final top stitch on the sleeve hem. So here is our side seam and our underarm seam. So I'm pressing from the back side, pressing it nice and flat. To get into the sleeve, it's a nice wide sleeve, so we can just pull it over the end of the ironing board. We're going to press that open as far as we can towards that join at the corner. We're going to do that for the other sleeve and side seam as well. And then we're just going to touch up the press for the hem. Again, nice wide sleeve. We're just going to bring that over the end of the ironing board and touch up that pressing because we've just pressed all the seams open. So once we've touched up that sleeve hem, we can apply some pins. We're going to stitch like we did with the other hem. We're going to stitch from the inside of the garment close to the folded edge, but I'll show you exactly how that works at the sewing machine. So here we have our sleeve hem. We're stitching it from the inside. I'm going to start stitching from the underarm seam. Again, I'm lining up the folded edge of the hem with the little red marking on my presser foot, and that's giving me about an 8-inch seam from the folded edge. I'm not going to back stitch to start because I'm just going to be stitching a big circle. So I'm so glad we did that pre-pressing of this hem. It's making this job so much easier. We're approaching the spot where we started stitching, so we will overlap that stitching and do a back stitch. We're going to trim our threads close to the garment. I'm going to do the exact same thing for the other sleeve, and then we will be ready to look at our finished top. So here we have the moment of truth. We have finished our sleeves and pressed it a little bit, just touched it up. So I'm ready to try my top on. I love how the fabric feels. I love the collar detail. Now, if you have seen the companion video, we have made a little belt that would be perfect. I actually used the same fabric for the ties and for the back. So I'm just going to wrap that around, tie it in the front. It might need a little bit of zhuzhing, but I think it's going to be very cool. And I think actually the height of the collar works perfectly with the belt. It's not super loose, oversized. Remember, we added 8 inches to our chest measurement. So if you use that amount of ease, you'll get a similar fit. I love the extra deep sleeves. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I think it is a really great thing to have as a DIY. You don't need a pattern, you just need a ruler and be able to measure and make your own pattern. So thank you so much for joining us. We've got lots of great content on our YouTube channel, including this belt. Don't forget to find that video on fabric weaving. We've also got lots of great content on our Instagram page. There's always some fun personal videos. We focus a little bit more on home decor as well. So follow us on Instagram and Facebook. So we're just going to end our video with a little bit of information about a hashtag that we're starting. It's hashtag SewTrueBeYou, and that's all about expressing yourself through your projects, being comfortable with yourself, being comfortable with expressing yourself through your fashion, through your home decor, through your crafts. So goodbye and SewTrueBeYou.